An archaeological discovery in South Africa has revealed humanity's most ancient secret, a cave that witnessed both the birth and death of the first hominids more than 6 million years ago. Amidst fossilized bones and primitive tools, scientists unearthed an epic tale of survival, love, and tragedy that will forever change our understanding of human origins. The first lights of dawn illuminated the arid plains of Africa as Cassie emerged from the cave that had been her home for her entire life. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon for signs of danger, while her children still slept in the rocky interior that protected them from nocturnal predators. Cassie did not know that she belonged to a species that would one day be called Australopithecus, nor that her cave would become the documented cradle of humanity. She only knew that she had to survive another day. The Meroping Cave, as it would later be named by archaeologists, housed a small community of about 15 individuals. They had discovered that the rock formations offered protection, not only against large felines and hyenas, but also against the violent storms that swept through the region. Over generations, that natural refuge had become more than a shelter. It was the heart of their primitive existence. Cassie was the matriarch of the group, a position earned through years of accumulated wisdom about the dangers and opportunities of the outside world. She knew the migratory patterns of animals, could identify edible and poisonous plants, and had a keen instinct for detecting changes in the weather. Her companions respected her not only for her experience, but for the courage she showed in leading expeditions in search of food and water. The group had developed a rudimentary system of communication through primitive gestures and sounds. Although they did not yet possess complex language, they could coordinate hunting and gathering activities with impressive efficiency. Cassie watched with pride as the young ones quickly learned the skills necessary for survival. Her eldest son, Tao, already showed signs of leadership, while her daughter, Nia, showed a special aptitude for finding nutritious fruits and roots. Life in the cave followed rhythms established over countless generations. During the day, small groups ventured into the surroundings in search of food, always keeping the cave in sight. At night, everyone gathered in the rocky interior, sharing the day's finds and warming each other against the cold that descended with the darkness. It was a precarious existence, but there was a primitive harmony in this community that faced the challenges of a hostile world together. On that particular morning, Cassie noticed something different in the air. The wind carried unfamiliar smells, and the birds seemed more agitated than usual. Her experience told her that changes were coming, although she could not imagine that these changes would forever alter the destiny of her family and the entire nascent human species. The first signs that something extraordinary was happening emerged when Tao returned from a hunting expedition with disturbing news. He had discovered strange footprints near the river that served as the main water source for the group. The marks were larger than those of any known animal and appeared to have been left by creatures that walked on 2 legs. Just like them, but with slightly different characteristics. Cassie carefully examined the drawings in the sand that Tao had reproduced with sticks. Her primitive mind struggled to process the information. There were others like them, but not exactly the same. The discovery awakened a mixture of curiosity and fear in the group. For generations, they had believed they were the only ones of their kind in that vast and seemingly infinite region. The discussions that followed were the most complex the group had ever experienced. Through elaborate gestures and sounds charged with emotion, they debated whether they should seek contact with these strangers or avoid them completely. Cassie, with her matriarchal wisdom, proposed a cautious approach. They would observe first, learn about these mysterious creatures before making any rash decisions. Over the following weeks, small reconnaissance groups were organized. Nia, with her natural ability to move silently through the vegetation, became the main scout. Her observations revealed that the strangers were, in fact, similar to them in many respects, but they possessed more sophisticated tools and seemed to have developed more advanced hunting techniques. Tension in the group grew when they discovered that these other hominids were gradually approaching their territory. The water sources and food gathering areas that had been exclusively theirs for generations were now being shared, sometimes resulting in tense encounters from a distance. Although there were no direct confrontations, both groups maintained a constant vigilance. Cassie realized that her community was undergoing a fundamental transformation. The young, especially Tao, showed a growing restlessness, as if some primitive instinct was compelling them to explore, to expand beyond the safe limits of the cave. At the same time, the older members of the group expressed increasing anxiety about the changes that seemed inevitable. The social dynamics within the cave began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Smaller groups formed spontaneously, some favoring an approach with the strangers, others defending complete isolation. Cassie found herself at the center of these primitive debates, trying to maintain the group's unity while dealing with her own doubts about the best path forward. One night, while contemplating the bright stars in the African sky, Cassie had a perception she could not express in words, but which she felt deeply in her being. They were living a historical moment, a turning point that would define not only the fate of their small community, but of something much greater that she could not yet fully comprehend. The inevitable encounter happened on a misty morning when Tao and two companions came face to face with a group of 3 strangers near the waterfall that marked the border of their ancestral territory. For a few eternal moments, both groups stood still, evaluating each other with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The strangers were slightly taller, with subtly different features, and carried spears with chipped stone tips more refined than any tool Cassie's group had ever seen. Surprisingly, it was one of the strangers who took the first step toward communication. Using slow and deliberate gestures, he pointed to himself, then to Tao, and finally to the sky, as if indicating some universal connection between them. Tao, following his instinct and remembering Cassie's teachings on primitive diplomacy, responded in a similar way, establishing the first known dialogue between different groups of hominids. When Tao returned to the cave with the news of the peaceful encounter, the group's reaction was explosive. Some members, led by the elder Jengo, argued that any contact with the strangers would bring disaster and death. Others, mainly the young, saw the approach as an opportunity to learn new survival techniques and expand their knowledge of the world. Cassie found herself torn between her natural caution and a growing curiosity about these creatures who seemed so similar to them. The decision she made at that moment would forever change the trajectory of both groups. She decided to organize a formal meeting on neutral ground, where representatives from both communities could interact under her direct supervision. The meeting was scheduled to take place in an open clearing, halfway between the territories of the two groups. Cassie carefully selected her delegation: herself, Tao, Nia, and 2 other respected members of the community. From the other side, a similar group approached, led by a female who seemed to have an age and status similar to Cassie's. The first moments of the meeting were tense, but they gradually evolved into a fascinating exchange of knowledge. The strangers demonstrated advanced tool-making techniques, while Cassie's group shared their superior knowledge of medicinal plants and regional weather patterns. Through elaborate gestures and practical demonstrations, they established a rudimentary system of intergroup communication. For hours, the 2 matriarchs observed each other, recognizing a shared ancestral wisdom that transcended superficial physical differences. It was as if each saw her own eyes reflected in the other's face, a profound connection that spoke of common origins lost in the mists of prehistoric time. The meeting ended with a tacit agreement of peaceful coexistence, but Cassie realized that something fundamental had changed. Her world, once limited to the known confines of her territory, had expanded dramatically. There were others like them, with different knowledge, complementary skills, and, Perhaps most importantly, their own stories to tell. As she returned to the cave, Cassie carried not only objects of exchange offered by the strangers, but a transformative understanding that her small community was part of something much bigger and more complex than she had ever imagined. The first signs that something extraordinary was happening emerged when Tao returned from a hunting expedition with disturbing news. He had discovered strange footprints near the river that served as the main water source for the group. The marks were larger than those of any known animal and appeared to have been left by creatures that walked on two legs. Just like them, but with slightly different characteristics. Cassie carefully examined the drawings in the sand that Tao had reproduced with sticks. Her primitive mind struggled to process the information. There were others like them, but not exactly the same. The discovery awakened a mixture of curiosity and fear in the group. For generations, they had believed they were the only ones of their kind in that vast and seemingly infinite region. The discussions that followed were the most complex the group had ever experienced. Through elaborate gestures and sounds charged with emotion, they debated whether they should seek contact with these strangers or avoid them completely. Cassie, with her matriarchal wisdom, proposed a cautious approach. They would observe first, learn about these mysterious creatures before making any rash decisions. Over the following weeks, small reconnaissance groups were organized. Nia, with her natural ability to move silently through the vegetation, became the main scout. Her observations revealed that the strangers were, in fact, similar to them in many respects, but they possessed more sophisticated tools and seemed to have developed more advanced hunting techniques. Tension in the group grew when they discovered that these other hominids were gradually approaching their territory. The water sources and food gathering areas that had been exclusively theirs for generations were now being shared, sometimes resulting in tense encounters from a distance. Although there were no direct confrontations, both groups maintained a constant vigilance. Cassie realized that her community was undergoing a fundamental transformation. The young, especially Tao, showed a growing restlessness, as if some primitive instinct was compelling them to explore, to expand beyond the safe limits of the cave. At the same time, the older members of the group expressed increasing anxiety about the changes that seemed inevitable. The social dynamics within the cave began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Smaller groups formed spontaneously, some favoring an approach with the strangers, others defending complete isolation. Cassie found herself at the center of these primitive debates, trying to maintain the group's unity while dealing with her own doubts about the best path forward. One night, while contemplating the bright stars in the African sky, Cassie had a perception she could not express in words, but which she felt deeply in her being. They were living a historical moment, a turning point that would define not only the fate of their small community, but of something much greater that she could not yet fully comprehend. Fate sealed the future of the two communities during a devastating storm that hit the region with unprecedented fury. Violent winds and torrential rains transformed peaceful streams into raging rivers, while lightning set the dry vegetation around the cave on fire. For 3 days and 3 nights, the combined members of the two groups huddled in the rocky interior, listening to the roar of unleashed nature outside. It was during the second night of the storm that Nia went into labor. Her child, conceived during the first weeks of peaceful coexistence with a young man from Amara's group, literally represented the hybrid future of the two lineages. Cassie and Amara worked side by side, using combined knowledge from their respective medical traditions to ensure a safe delivery under extremely adverse conditions. The birth of the child, a robust boy who would later be known by archaeologists as the first documented hybrid between different groups of hominids, marked a moment of transcendental transformation. As Cassie held the newborn against her chest, she realized that she was witnessing not just the birth of a child, but the symbolic birth of a new phase in human evolution. The storm finally passed, but its effects were devastating. The landscape had been completely transformed. Centuries-old trees had been uprooted. Familiar rock formations had collapsed, and many of the known water sources had changed their course or dried up completely. The world that both groups had known for generations simply no longer existed. Facing this altered reality, the two communities had no choice but to adapt or perish. Cassie and Amara organized joint expeditions to map the new territory, identify alternative sources of food and water, and establish new survival patterns suitable for the transformed conditions. Cooperation ceased to be a choice and became an absolute necessity. During these expeditions, they discovered something that would forever change their understanding of the world. Other caves, similar to Maruping, scattered throughout the region, some containing evidence of occupation by still different groups of hominids. The revelation that there were many more others than they had ever imagined was both exciting and terrifying. Cassie, now a grandmother to the first intergroup hybrid, found herself at the epicenter of decisions that would affect not only her immediate community, but potentially the future of the entire nascent human species. Her experience and wisdom made her an almost mythical figure, respected not only by her own original group, but by the entire expanded community. The final decision came during a nightly assembly around the cave's central fire. Cassie proposed that they abandon the concept of separate groups and reorganize as a single expanded tribe, incorporating the best aspects of both ancestral cultures. It would be an audacious experiment in social evolution, but the circumstances offered no viable alternatives. When the primitive vote ended, conducted through a system of stones placed in piles representing different options, the result was clear. The first truly multicultural society in human history had been born. Cassie closed her eyes that night, knowing that she had participated in something monumentally historic. Although she could not fully predict the consequences of her actions for future generations. In the weeks that followed the first meeting, the consequences of the rapprochement between the two groups became increasingly evident and complex. Cassie watched with growing concern as her community divided into distinct factions. Tao had become the leader of a movement that favored complete integration with the strangers, while Django mobilized the traditionalists who saw change as a threat to the integrity of their ancestral culture. The tension reached its peak when Nia announced her intention to leave with the strangers to learn their advanced techniques of primitive agriculture. For Cassie, the possibility of losing her daughter represented not only an unbearable personal pain, but a sign that the forces she had set in motion were escaping her control. The tears she shed that night were the first recorded in the history of nascent humanity. The strangers, in turn, faced similar dilemmas. Their leader, who had been named Amara by Cassie's companions, struggled to maintain the cohesion of her own group, while some of her members expressed a desire to settle permanently near the Maruping cave. The mutual attraction between the two communities was creating social pressures that neither matriarch had anticipated. During this turbulent period, external events began to influence the decisions of both groups. A prolonged drought had drastically reduced water sources in the region, forcing large animals to migrate to other areas. The scarcity of game placed additional pressure on limited resources, making collaboration between the groups not only desirable but essential for survival. It was in this context of extreme need that Cassie and Amara made the most audacious decision of their lives. They proposed a temporary merger of their groups during the period of scarcity. The proposal generated intense debates in both communities, but the brutal reality of imminent hunger eventually prevailed over cultural and territorial concerns. The forced coexistence in the Maruping cave revealed both the profound similarities and the subtle differences between the two groups. The children of both communities played together with instinctive naturalness, while the adults carefully navigated the complexities of sharing space, resources, and leadership responsibilities. Cassie discovered that Amara possessed knowledge of celestial navigation that perfectly complemented her own expertise in reading weather patterns. Together, they developed more effective survival strategies than either of them could have created in isolation. The collaboration between the two matriarchs became a model for the entire expanded community. However, not everything went harmoniously. Minor conflicts arose regularly over food preparation methods, tool-making techniques, and even the organization of space within the cave. Each dispute tested the leadership abilities of Kessie and Amara, forcing them to develop diplomatic skills that their ancestors had never needed. One night, while observing the mixed group of children sleeping peacefully around the central fire, Kessie had a profound revelation. They were witnessing and facilitating the birth of something completely new in human history, the first true multi-tribal society, united not by blood ties, but by mutual need and the recognition of shared humanity. Years passed since the Great Storm, and the Meroping Cave had become the center of a thriving community that had grown to include more than 50 individuals from different backgrounds. Kessie, now a revered elder, watched with deep satisfaction as the hybrid children played together, speaking a primitive language that combined elements of the ancestral dialects of both original groups. The grandson, who had been born during the storm, had grown into a strong and intelligent young man, a physical bearer of the symbolic union between the two lineages. The community had developed unique traditions that honored both the diverse origins of its members and their emerging collective identity. Cave paintings adorned the walls, telling the story of the Great Union through symbols that would be deciphered millennia later by archaeologists astonished by the artistic sophistication of their remote ancestors. These images captured not only historical events, but complex emotions and relationships that transcended the limitations of primitive language. Kessie had become humanity's first historian, orally preserving the memories of the times before the Union and transmitting them to the younger generations through sung narratives that combined facts with mythical elements. Her stories about the times of separation served as important reminders about the importance of cooperation and mutual tolerance. Amara, her co-leader and close friend, had developed a rudimentary system of agriculture that allowed the community to cultivate food plants near the cave, reducing their dependence on hunting and gathering. This innovation not only improved the group's food security, but also allowed them to establish a more permanent residence, developing the first true sedentary civilization in documented human history. During her final years, Kessie often walked to the cave entrance at sunrise, contemplating the vast African plains that stretched to the horizon. She knew instinctively that her community was only the beginning of something much bigger, that other groups scattered across the region would eventually follow similar paths of cooperation and social evolution. Her decisions had planted seeds that would blossom over millennia. Death came for Kessie on a quiet winter night, as she slept surrounded by her extended family. Her body was carefully prepared according to rituals that combined traditions from both ancestral groups, and she was buried in the most honorable place in the cave, a small side chamber that would become humanity's first known cemetery. Her personal belongings, including specially crafted tools and unique ornaments, were buried with her as offerings for the spiritual journey. Amara lived for a few more years after Kessie's death, serving as the sole guardian of the memories and traditions of the unified community. When she finally joined her friend in eternal rest, she was buried beside Kessie, their fossilized hands positioned to suggest that, even in death, they continued to cooperate and support each other. The Meroping Cave continued to house subsequent generations for thousands of years, each building upon the legacy left by Kessie and Amara. Eventually, climate changes forced the abandonment of the site, but not before it had served as a cradle for developments that would influence all subsequent human evolution. When modern archaeologists finally discovered and excavated the cave, they found evidence of a surprisingly sophisticated and diverse society whose origins dated back more than 6 million years. a lasting testament to the transformative power of cooperation, courage, and the vision of two extraordinary women who dared to imagine a better future for their nascent species.